So welcome and thank you for joining us today for this live fireside chat with EPIC on conservation finance in the Sentinel Landscapes. My name is Michelle and I'm the Program Associate for Strategic Initiatives here at the Conservation Finance Network. We are very pleased to bring you an exciting conversation today and look forward to taking your questions at the end of the presentation. You will have joined us with your video off and your audio off, and we ask that you keep them off throughout the event and instead submit your questions at any time throughout the discussion using the chat box, and we will answer them at the end. This conversation will also be recorded and will be posted to our website for those looking to enjoy or share this content at a later date. Before we get started, I just want to take the opportunity to explain CFN's connections to the Sentinel Landscape Initiative. CFN was actually founded in part with support from the DoD's REPI program, the Readiness and Environmental Protection Integration Program. And REPI was an early supporter of CFN's mission to promote innovative and effective funding and financing strategies and recognize the connections to its own landscape work. We have been fortunate to receive support from REPI through the U.S. Endowment once more to specifically help the Sentinel Landscapes explore the conservation finance potential in their areas. And this involves creating and sharing content like you're about to see, as well as providing technical assistance for tapping into existing and emerging sources of funding. So we bring this event to you as a part of our work on this topic, and we encourage you to check out our other resources created through this work on our new Sentinel Landscapes program page on our website. Now I will pass it along to CFN's Director, Lee Welpton, who will be moderating the discussion today and who will introduce our guest.
Thank you, Michelle, and thanks everybody for making time on a Friday afternoon. Hopefully you're enjoying some crisp fall weather, a little sunshine here and there. So as Michelle said, the Conservation Finance Network, our theory of change is really that we can increase the amount of money deployed for conservation by focusing on the human capabilities. So increasing people's ability to actually put innovative and effective funding and financing strategies to practice. We grew out of a week-long innovation workshop of sorts. The Conservation Finance Bootcamp first started in 2007. Fun fact, very relevant to this discussion, it was at the 2011 course over a Tuesday night pizza dinner of some nature that the REPI Challenge was first envisioned. So, you know, partly just some natural momentum building from those courses, it catalyzed this national network and community of practice, which was very much graciously enabled through seed funding from the Readiness and Environmental Protection Integration Program, to whom we just owe a debt of gratitude. So I'm going to pivot over to Tim here. We are thrilled today to be joined by Tim Mayle, Founder and Executive Director of the Environmental Policy Innovation Center. Prior to EPIC, Tim served in a lot of really incredible roles, one being the Associate Director at White House CEQ, the Vice President for Conservation Policy at Defenders, Director at NIFWF, and Co-Director of Ag Policy at EDF. I want to call out one particular aspect of a very impactful career. While at CEQ, Tim was a driving force behind a presidential memorandum on mitigating impacts on natural resources from development and encouraging related private investment. And as a veritable student of how we scale and mature environmental markets, I came to find really the thought and the effort and the motivation behind that presidential memorandum to be extremely instructful, if not itself really a change agent in how it was meant to provide comprehensive policy direction across the federal family, promoting stability and growth in mitigation marketplaces. So it really kind of helped me understand how the world works in terms of what federal agencies, what on-the-ground conservation partners, and what mitigation providers or project developers need to all come together to develop and deliver really efficient, effective solutions, better for all. So Tim, thank you for the instruction and education That's a bit on Tim's bio on the heavy hitting side. I might also just throw in on the fluffy side. You are sometimes able to catch Tim with a litter of golden retriever puppies on various Zoom calls and or meetings. So it's a pleasure to have you with us, Tim. And with that, I think I'll just pass it right over to you to start off on some table setting for where this report came from, what some of the really key messages you want to get across are, and then we'll just go straight into fireside chat with some questions I've got to move us along.
Thanks so much, Lee, and apologies to the audience that I don't have any puppies with me today, because they do make Zoom better. EPIC is a 3-year-old organization, and we really focus on ideas that would allow conservation to happen faster. We have programs in specific areas, but we're pretty agnostic as an organization on what those program areas are. But what we care about is that there's a way to deliver the conservation result that people want in a more expeditious manner, and it's connected to policy, right? So we work on, I love projects, but we tend to always look at the project and how does that reflect back on a way to do things at a more programmatic scale. My connection with DoD goes back a long time, and have a couple of experiences on inactive installations, but also on active installations. This is a picture from Fort Hood, Texas, one of the largest Army installations in the country, where the 1st Armored Division, Tank Division is based. And I worked monitoring endangered birds on the base, right? I was a tree hugger side by side with all this military training, but was just blown away by the level of investment that the Army was making in trying to keep the populations of these endangered birds stable or growing on the installation, while simultaneously being able to train and test and prepare, train troops, test weapons, and prepare for war and defense, and really, really exceptional progress. So, you know, it really sort of changed my mind in a way that no academic preparation would have, for thinking about DoD as a, you know, really an equal partner. I think of them the same way I think of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service when it comes to, once you're in the conservation space, you know, how well they do what they do. So next slide, please, Michelle. So we put together, we published this report last year, The Conservation of Defense, and it was born out of a collaboration and a discussion really with the foundation. We said if we tried to imagine what the next decade of ambitious conservation could look like done in partnership with the military, what might that be? What might it include? What kind of assumptions would you have to make? How do we help that achieve its potential? And the whole project was premised on respect for the military mission. So it wasn't how do we force the military to do things that aren't in their primary mission interest, but how do we really find common ground where doing something for the military also creates a big conservation benefit. And certainly for Lee and Michelle, and I know for many of you on the video call, that you get that. You get that this has to be about DoD's primary mission. But I think that there are enormous opportunities to expand this, and we'll definitely get at some of that in the Q&A. But I just wanted to sort of provide some stage setting context. Next slide, please. So here's a map of the sort of military space of interest in Southern California. You see an awful lot of the state of California shaded in different colors. And that to me is what the sort of important landscapes look like. You could map it in various ways in different parts of the country and talk more about the buffering space as opposed to the, you know, the airspace, the sea space, the actual footprint of installations. But they have interests that go way beyond their fence line. That's the first thing to be aware of. So, you know, the military has, you can go to the next slide, please, is managing something like 27 million acres of land in the country. It's actually interesting and surprising how often the congressional reports about how much land the military manages go up and down by a significant amount. Can't quite explain that myself, but big chunk of that is directly operated or owned by the military. Another portion is withdrawn lands from other federal agencies. That puts DoD at like the, you know, the 5th largest federal landowner. So half the size of national parks, twice the size of state parks. It's a big space of land. The bottom chart on this slide shows the density of wildlife, of endangered species and imperiled species on military installations. So they may not have the most land of any federal agency, but they have a far higher density of rare wildlife. That's partly because their land base is built in an intentional fashion. They have diverse lands that they can practice training in diverse settings to deal with the reality of the world. So lots of water, lots of land in the south, more biodiverse areas, big spaces, big chunks of land, so places that provide lots of habitat. Next slide, please. And this slide sort of summarizes, and I won't read all these, but summarizes some of the sort of top line numbers for DoD as how they relate to conservation. So as I mentioned, more endangered species, than any other federal agency on a per acre basis. Next slide, please. And then from a legal context, and we could talk more about some of this stuff in the Q&A, and I know that Lee and Michelle are deeply involved in a lot of these programs. What I wanted to emphasize with this slide is there's a diversity of laws that capture the connection between military and conservation, and those laws are changed frequently. Whereas I work a lot in the Endangered Species Act, a law that hasn't changed in any real fundamental way for like 25 years. DoD's natural resource authorities have changed frequently because there's a lot of bipartisan interest in Congress in helping the military do what it wants to do and what it needs to do. That to me is just a sort of a really interesting place to work on policy compared to, as I said, the endangered species space or a number of other spaces that some of you may work. Next slide. And we'll talk about the ways that, or the reasons that the military cares about conservation, but I just find this slide of fire and dust storm and flood to be a really real world visual tool to remember just how important the landscape and the effects of nature and climate change are to the military. This is the U.S. Strategic Command, missile defense and nuclear weapons capacity of the United States, flooded in Nebraska, Habab, a dust storm in the Southwest that can ground all aircraft for an Air Force base, and a wildfire in California a couple of years ago that forced the evacuation of a military installation. First time the military installation had been evacuated, right? Because of a wildfire that threatened the ability of people to be present on the installation. So conservation is directly relevant, and landscapes are directly relevant to the military's ability to do what it needs to do to keep the country safe. Next slide. As I mentioned at the outset, we did this project trying to think about what does the military need? What does the military need from conservation? There's a sort of status view or present view of what that looks like. The installation on the bottom here is a naval air station in Virginia Beach in the state of Virginia. Protection from encroachment is a sort of really important issue. Conservation sometimes can encroach on military mission, but housing developments or other infrastructure can be probably a more pressing concern that can really prevent an installation from being able to serve its purpose. On the top here, I've captured the logo of Space Force and a picture of a hypersonic weapon. These are changes in what the military needs in the future that are going to change the footprint that they need, either to train and operate on or as a buffer to installations and operations to protect the American people from the risk that something goes wrong in training, right? So a weapon that's going 5 times the speed of sound, if something goes slightly wrong, it's a lot harder, and there's a lot bigger space in which you want to have kept people safe in terms of just minimizing risk. And that's a conservation opportunity. It's a challenge for the military to find those spaces. It's a conservation opportunity because conservation is often a very compatible use for that kind of buffer protection. Next slide. And these are a set of points, and I'm going to return to this slide at the very end if we can. They just sort of emphasize some sort of top line principles that we'll cover in detail on this presentation. Conservation can be alongside military activity or mitigation for impacts from it. Those areas are often buffered. It's not troops on the ground, lots of presence, lots of disturbance, but really just open space that protects people from what the military is doing. We think that the Department of Defense will need to expand its land base mostly in those buffers, and the report is premised on a 5 million acre expansion in presence or effect, including land protection. We included land protection in that for conservation or agricultural land preservation. The conservation must have a military benefit. I already mentioned that. We think of DoD as a kind of a partner, a really big partner with a very long-term perspective. And that is long-term perspective, right, is a huge challenge in the investment finance space. A lot of people have very short-term perspectives. It's nice and interesting to work with somebody who's really thinking from on a decadal basis what they need in the future. And then, as I mentioned with the slide about the authorities, DoD already has authority that allows it to prioritize natural resource issues, including climate change and adaptation. So I'm going to stop there. That's sort of some of the overall points that I wanted to make to set up the conversation with Lee.
Thanks, Tim. And I'll just keep us rolling here. Just to give an easy segue framing to the money side, where this hits budget and finance questions and considerations. So as big as the defense budget is, excuse me, why is the funding we have insufficient for the land management needs, excuse me, of the landscapes that DoD operates in?
Yeah, I mean, big budget, right? $580 billion. It's the same size. The discretionary budget for the military is the same size or actually bigger than the entire rest of the federal discretionary budget combined. And it's still not enough money to do everything that the military wants, and then to deal with this conservation piece. I think the reason that there's two reasons that I think of that are really important from a conservation finance perspective. First, there just isn't enough money, so anything that can help provide more resources to help DoD's resources go further is crucial. And so we can get into some examples where that kind of finance might be possible. The other is really, to me, around temporal issues and speed. So even if DoD has enough money over, let's say, 10 years or 15 years to deal with an encroachment issue, there's a huge cost in taking 15 years to do that. Whereas if you could do it all up front, you could have a much more efficient, more cost-effective solution. DoD just may not have the resources, the Congress may not have given them the resources to put all that money into one place at one time. There's political pressure that makes it difficult to do so as well. So if there's a way to create partnerships that allow private money or state money or local money to sort of flood the space and solve much more of a problem up front and figure out a way to pay it back with DoD resources or DoD and partner resources over time, there's a lot of benefit in doing that. It's sort of analogous to me in the wildfire space, trying to treat a much bigger area of Western forests, try to lower their risk of carrying a very severe wildfire. If we just do a little bit a year, it's pretty unclear that we're going to get the kind of benefits that we want. And so you need to sort of scale up your investment. And I think those are the two places that conservation finance has the most benefit. But I guess the last thing I'll say, and you guys know this, and you guys are one, is just having partners, right? So it's nice to know that you're in it with somebody else, that somebody thinks you're important enough to be a partner too. And so there's value in just knowing that you've got partners that want to do this too.
Well, the point at incrementalism is certainly well made, and in the context of wildfires in the West, well understood. I wonder, you get into some of this in the report, but just to draw out the specific implications, how do you understand that it's a money problem, and how do you understand that it's actually a policy and authority problem, or perhaps just that capacity and partner problem to be able to do that front loading?
They asked me that to tell me a little bit more about that question. I'm trying to figure out.
So is it a money problem? Is it is it a policy problem? Is it a capacity problem?
Yeah, I mean, it's all three, right? That's the challenge. So I mean, I guess maybe I'll respond by taking on the policy part of the problem, because that's what we're most focused on. There really aren't the tools to manage, to bridge that kind of multi-year financing. That's very difficult to do. I mean, the easiest one to capture, explain is the legal restriction that prevents federal agencies from committing money today that hasn't been obligated yet, like by Congress in future years. That's a huge barrier it's a huge risk to investors, right? You might say, well, sure, we'll give you $100 million as long as you pay it back over this period of time. Well, we can't commit to that, right? If we're a federal agency, if the partner is a federal agency, that's a really tough barrier, even though everyone's ideas might be aligned, their priorities might be aligned. And the reality is the amount of money you're talking about is the very same amount of money they've had every single year. So it sure doesn't look very risky. It's still hard to commit on, on paper. I think that's a policy problem, and there are workarounds to it. Your partner organizations like foundations are one workaround to it. But and where you could put money into a foundation and then use that foundation's authority, to pay it back over multiple years. So that's, to me, one example of a policy issue. The other is the multi-benefits and ideally the multi-payer nature of a lot of these things. So if DoD is protecting farmland because they don't want an incompatible use next to them, protecting that farmland has value to the ag economy of the area in which the installation is embedded, but there may not be a way to capture that value in that industry paying for a portion of the benefit they're getting by keeping a certain level of ag operations around. So those kinds of structures are hard to create in policy. They're hard to create in practice, but we need more tools that allow us to do that.
So you do mention one example of a pilot in California in the report, the Joint Benefit Authority, as a, conceived upon and kind of proof of concept, we hope, in being able to join together the budgetary authorities through a special purpose vehicle, at least at the municipal level, for, multiple benefits accruing to different agencies. In that case, underserved open space access, traffic calming, and I believe green infrastructure, stormwater management. So I do think if we can press into some of the suggestions in the report about pooled funding opportunities, I think, and in our discussions with REPI too, a lot of what the capacity need is, a lot of what the project flywheel need is that ability to really stick together different flavors, sources, types of money, and to have some kind of new and creative ways to do so. So bringing to the question, do we need new organizations like foundations or other intermediaries who can help to stick together or commingle funds, bring together programs and partner authorities? Or are there some existing partners out there, and I'm thinking specifically about some of the congressionally or bilaterally chartered nonprofits like NIFWF, like the National Forest Foundation, like the U.S. Endowment, who might be able to help play that role?
Yeah, those are all great examples. I don't need to repeat them. I think that it may be helpful to have Congress give them specific direction to to basically operate in a military in this context as with the military as a major partner, a major funding partner, and a mission partner. So that's the sort of policy gap that I see there. Getting Congress or federal agencies to commit, across, let's say, Department of Interior, USDA, and DoD, to put money into a fund. That's something else that also takes negotiation and agreement. That involves multiple branches of government in Washington, D.C. or in a region. But those are solvable, and I think that there's so many shared interests between DoD and Department of Agriculture or Department of Interior and other agencies too, Commerce, NOAA, that it shouldn't be that hard. And the devil is in the, how do we decide how much this is worth to us? How much money would we, if you said to the Department of Interior, how much money have we put on the ground in a particular landscape over the last 20 years? And you asked what that number was. Let's say it was $15 million. Say, okay, well, you put $15 million into this place over the last 15 years. Would you be willing to commit $15 million for the next period of time in the exact same place? Like, well, no. like it's just scary, right? It's a scary sort of thought for people to actually have to commit out in the future, especially across multiple years. It's solvable, but I think it's hard. The other places, so the idea of pooling funding a foundation is one sort of obvious way to solve that problem. And the examples you gave, I think, are like very mission focused, very effective organizations. There's also the option, one of the things we wrote about in the report was trying trying to use existing authority at the White House Council on Environmental Quality, sort of loosely referred to as pass the hat authority, to pool money at that level to create sort of shared alignment. I think there's also policy work, pretty informal policy work that could be done by the Office of Management and Budget at the White House that allows agencies to sort of pool their tracking of resources. And one of the ways you think of it as an agency cross-cut budget. An agency cross-cut budget, from my view, is just the budget's reporting back to the White House on what they spent money on. But the sort of real holy grail is also sharing the contracting authorities and the billing process. If they can unify some of those things from a procurement perspective, that could be extremely helpful. So so getting Office of Management and Budget's willingness to help pilot projects that that can merge some of those kinds of authorities would be amazing from my perspective. Even just things like sharing RFPs and allowing the same RFP to function from an obligation perspective on money, something like that would be really sort of revolutionary approach.
Well, and I do think, the investment in the Sentinel Landscape, specifically this last decade, deserves quite a lot of credit for focusing on the pooled priorities, if you will, and really thinking about capacity to bring together those partnership objectives in a far more coordinated and efficient capacity. So I think maybe I'll segue into a question related to community partners. As we are coming in to work with Sentinel Landscapes, and as we start to better understand some of the unique on-the-ground dynamics in some of the bases and installations in surrounding communities and regions, I'm curious for your perspective on how you mobilize community partners to actually put up some of the funding, and any examples you have of that being done particularly well.
The examples that I wanted to mention are not necessarily the fund. They're sort of indirectly, I guess, the funding. One is older, and I think sort of predates a conservation, or the beginnings of it predate a conservation focus. And that's the installation I showed the picture of earlier, the Naval Air Station Oceana in Virginia Beach. That installation was subject to, in the early round of a BRAC, a base realignment and closure process, was identified as an installation that might get closed in the first draft of one in 2005, I think, which freaks people out in Virginia Beach. That installation is the largest employer, piles of other reasons why you don't want your military installation and largest employer to leave. And the installation is still there today. That recent picture is an example of that. And so they figured out a way to both to make the economic case that it's cheaper to stay here than it is to go away, coupled with a costly but not directly monetary shift in local policy, which were zoning changes that protected the area around the installation from a lot more encroachment. That partnership has since evolved in ways that cover resilience and sea level rise and a whole suite of sort of green infrastructure initiatives that really are focused on conservation. But its first iteration, and I think it's really important to consider that, is purely economic self-interest, right? And that's often the case with these kinds of issues. Another example is again a naval station Earl in southern New Jersey, which is one of the most important East Coast installations to store live ordnance, for the naval vessels, large amounts of explosive things that you want to be able to get on and off ships really efficiently and keep people safe from. So that installation, is a critical resource for the Navy, but also faced risks from sea level rise, flooding, and then from coastal development. And that's a great recent example of a community planning process and a willingness for the state and for the county to invest in land protection side by side with DoD as real partners on protecting the base from the kinds of encroachment that could really affect it. And then for the base and the county and the state to invest in kind of flood risk reduction projects like marsh creation and invasive species control on really large acreages. This is I think it's a 12,000 acre installation with like 2,000 acres of wetlands already on the installation. So they're talking about facilitated sea level rise, facilitated basically marsh movement, marsh, whatever you want to call it, marching away from the sea to try to build local resilience. So I think, to me, those are some of the examples. And again, they're not directly monetary, but you're saying, well, this is how this piece of land can be used. This is how that piece of land can be used. Think of it almost in a takings context. I mean, that's not irrelevant. It's going to have an impact on the people who own those properties, but collectively has a community benefit.
Well, and since you brought it up, I think there's something important in the expansion of 2684A. I don't think there is something very important in the expansion of that authority to help installations manage for climate change, the marching type of ramifications that you brought up. And I guess I'm curious for your perspective, are conservationists really clued in to what that broad authority enables in terms of project opportunities, if not business opportunities, especially for the conservation finance universe?
No, they're not keyed in enough. And we tend to first think about planning. Well, let's do some planning as a way for us all to get a little bit smarter. I think there's sort of better first steps, and those better first steps, and particularly the pieces that connected to the finance and investment side, I think they have to be mediated through conversations about how do we measure changes in resilience, how do we measure changes in sustainability of an installation's footprint or airspace or sea space. How do we measure changes in endangered species population impacts on training abilities? So I think the currency question is super important from the DoD perspective, and I've heard those stories a number of times from military leaders who basically say, well, we did this for a number of years, and we're not doing it anymore because we can't tell there's a quantified benefit. So it's really difficult to like sell someone something where they can't quantify it, monetize it, and explain it to somebody else who's not there with them on the ground. So I think if we're going to speed up that conversation, make it more relevant, we need to be much more aggressive about defining what resilience is and how to measure a unit's change in resilience. Right. So the sea level is still going to rise X amount. What does it look like for this installation to have less flooding? How do we measure the impact of flooding, dollar value of flooding? The same thing is true in the wildfire risk perspective, on a water supply perspective. So if we can come up with some simple, operational, adaptive ways to measure things, I think it would be easier to start really using finance to step into that space of helping show stronger resilience for military installations. And it's an argument you and I have talked about this dozens of times as of your food camps. It's like the perfect versus the good, and we in the conservation community are often waiting for the perfect because we're sort of just uncomfortable letting go of something that's slightly flawed, and that's I just think that's we're not the next 50 years we can't do that anymore. We don't have time to wait.
Well, and I'll play off that just because I happen to know you're a bit bullish about the opportunity for pay for success or outcomes-based financing. There are some emerging ideas out there on how you deliver quantified outcomes, measurable, for the purpose of monitoring things like land loss subsidence, or other ways that we kind of act now and learn about how well those project models deliver the desired benefit in a way that does shift the risk to the private sector partner. Now there are many considerations for what context that actually works in, but just curious for your perspective under the umbrella of the expanded authority for climate resilience.
Yeah, I think, the military has done this many times over the years. They have been part of facilitated, roundtables, blue ribbon commissions, formal, structured dialogues that happen over an extended period of time. And on this subject, and following up on your mention of pay for success, I think there's a real need for a discussion about could we start coming up with some metrics and some approaches and some models that are good enough to reflect what experts think is probably the kind of long-term performance you're going to get can be achieved fast enough that the payment for it is going to be attractive to investor-backed initiatives, and that it's certain enough from the military's perspective that they're really buying something worthwhile in these kinds of initiatives. So I think that kind of dialogue that pulls out some high-level concepts is incredibly important. There's an enormous amount of policy that we need to discuss right now, and it's very definitional, operational, but definitional in terms of what climate change means, what is the foreseeable future, what is a unit of greater resiliency from, again, fire, flood, whatever, pick your poison.
Pick your disaster.
Pick your disaster. That conversation is something that I think we could have really productively. And if you, the thing that I find refreshing in your audience and with the investment community is they see sort of a burning desire to figure out how to measure things. Let me just, one last comment I'll say is that pay for success or performance contracting, it's often misunderstood. And people think of, well, we have to measure the ultimate goal. We have to wait, no one gets paid until the ultimate goal is measured, right? Like the child has graduated college, right? As opposed to like they've been born and they've graduated, we have to wait till they graduate college. It's not like that. It's moving from very immediate outputs, like hours worked or backhoe operator hours, equipment uses. It's moving from that, which is really not at all connected to any outcome, to something in the middle, which is timely and has a pretty strong correlation or connection to these long-term outcomes. Health of the Chesapeake Bay, that's awesome. More eelgrass, that's a little closer. Better water quality in that watershed that contributes, where the eelgrass lives, to trees that are surviving and thriving, to seedlings planted, right? And so it's in that middle there that we need to start finding things that we can agree are, pretty good metrics to make multi-million or multi-billion-dollar gambles around.
Sure. Well, points well made on that front. And I think, pivoting a little maybe to the species universe, species crediting, not without its critics, but I've always been struck by REPI's very real and proactive interest in species conservation, in making those investments outside of the fence line, doing that offsite mitigation, garnering more flexibility for future impacts. I'm wondering how you think the kind of conservation finance community can do better in supporting REPI with some creative approaches, particularly to ESA or other species, threatened vulnerable species management issues in terms of a project development standpoint.
Yeah, it's really exciting what DoD is doing right now with gopher tortoise, desert tortoise, and a handful of other species. We shouldn't let pass the news last Friday, I think, that the red-cockaded woodpecker has been proposed for downlisting. That announcement was made on a military installation. There are, I can't remember, 4 Air Force bases, 8 Army bases, and a Marine Corps base, which have red-cockaded woodpeckers. The Army has seen the population of red-cockaded, well, not seen, they've helped the population of red-cockaded woodpeckers on Air Force bases go up by like 200, 300%. So it's sort of these enormous successes. I think it's, yes, the investors can help, but there's a key policy barrier, which is if DoD is going to invest outside the fence line in either bolstering the protection of or bolstering the size and stability of an endangered species population, it needs to clearly affect their Section 7 interagency, federal agency future obligations under a consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service. That part, that mediation of that liability has not changed. So to translate it from a wetland banking perspective, one of the core elements of wetland banking policy is there's a liability transfer. You're a mine and you have liability for the wetlands you're going to impact from the mine. You buy mitigation credits from somebody else and they take the liability, right? It's now their liability. They have a contractual legal obligation to enhance or protect whatever number of wetlands exists. And that ability to transfer that liability is not clean or transparent, or simple, or clear, nor is there consensus around any of the sort of policies around the ESA. It could be. There's no reason that idea isn't just as defensible in a species context as it is in a wetland context. but we don't have that yet. And I think there's some promising stuff, particularly I'm thinking about gopher tortoise, where installations and the Fish and Wildlife Service in the Southeast are starting to think about this idea of sort of a defined level of effort that you put into species conservation in exchange for certainty with your future consultations. I think that's really exciting. It's absolutely the right way to go. And investor-backed efforts, bank efforts could absolutely provide supplies of things that the military needs to locate more endangered species obligations outside of fence lines, so that they can focus, inside of fence lines on training.
Yeah, it seems to be a really key thing of either a functional marketplace or an incentive to actually place an investment to have that, the kind of certainty very clearly articulated, especially in terms of risk management. So I think that's a really key point to clue in on there. I just want to speak to the audience for a second. I've got at least 2 more questions that I'm dying to ask Tim, but I don't want to skip the opportunity to catch yours. So please send those through, and Michelle's going to hop on in a second here and ask them. In the meantime, to buy you a second for translating thoughts to Q&A submissions, something that I've been struck by, again, our interest is very much in contextualizing some of the insight from the report to the kind of so what now for funding and financing solutions in Sentinel Landscapes. And in a lot of ways, Sentinel Landscapes are just large landscape partnerships. But in other ways, they really present, REPI and DoD being a partner there, really presents a unique influence, a unique set of authorities, paired with significant and reliable funding as a long-term veritable investment partner in the landscape. So I'm wondering about Sentinel Landscapes as proving grounds for coordinated landscape funding and financing, and kind of your view on if that's really the best place for us to crack the nut on how to do that level of coordinated and large planning and project execution for ecosystem functional level goals.
Yeah, there have been so many efforts at landscape scale, work.
Exactly.
And they tend to get really focused on planning, and not operationalizing, which I know is your all sweet spot. And I don't know exactly how to break out of that, but we definitely need some new ideas. And so I'll just put 2 things on the table. One is, has anyone created a loan program around the core concepts of Sentinel Landscapes? And to really say, well, why isn't there a loan program? Why isn't there something, either government-backed or market-backed, but it doesn't operate like a loan program? If it's not there, why isn't it there? Why aren't the things that we're all getting, kind of, local economic security, military benefits, why isn't that material? Why isn't it valuable enough to pay back, a big loan? I think that's sort of a really interesting area of exploration. If I were going to do a sort of mini report focused on finance as a result of the one we did, that kind of round table kind of exercise would be really useful. And then figure out how to pilot it. The other is just creating some local institutions. So we talked about creating sort of national, structures, but think of green banks like DC's, Green Bank, or Penvest in Pennsylvania. State agency financing partnerships, local county-based financing partnerships that have this mission, the mission of the landscape partnership, the Sentinel Landscape, as its core mission. And don't worry about the plan so much as focusing on creating an institution that has this clear purpose and has tools that it can use to bring partners to the table. And I think we don't jump into just doing that often enough, just building that plan, and setting big goals. So that you still need the goals, you still need where is the goalpost, what does the field look like, but you don't need to map out every individual play. We tend to focus on mapping out every individual play. So I think it would be really interesting to try to get like a county or a regional authority to create some kind of structure like a green bank in effect that has multiple authorities to bring in state and local funding to match with USDA or with DoD funding, well, USDA too, and try to put big projects together. It's somebody who can receive federal money or state money, so it has the kind of nonprofit, for-profit structure, whatever that structure looks like, to get SRF funding or grant funding, block pots of funding that would come directly from Congress. I think that's worth trying too.
Well, my last question was going to be for your moonshot, but I think you just articulated it. So I see Michelle has rejoined us on video here, which means she's got some audience questions to pass our way.
Great, thanks Lee, and thanks Tim. We do have a couple questions. One, back in the vein of climate change resilience, we have a question about what opportunities do you see in creating finance opportunities from public and private funding sources focused on farmland preservation and ag economic enhancements as a way to build climate change resilience to an anchor base in a Sentinel landscape?
All right, so finance opportunities for public and private ag enhancement.
Yep, and there's a secondary part there as a suggestion perhaps. Is the Growing Climate Solutions Act a possible path forward?
I'm going to start with the first part of the question, and I hope you weigh in on these as well.
Sure.
And so I read in that, there's a couple things in that question which aren't to me immediately aligned. Sort of climate change piece of it in agriculture is one part, and then the viable, sustainable, strong ag landscapes. I think you could argue that we need there's this debate going on around intensification of agriculture versus lower intensity, more sustainable agriculture. I think that you could make a really strong case that some DoD installations are placed in such a way that they can really maintain a strong, higher productivity ag landscape. And how to describe that partnership in terms of the kind of economic development jobs situations that can exist. And that's not an environmental outcome that I'm describing. So I suppose I should focus more on that one. I'll focus on the first one. Soil carbon, right? So initiatives to build soil carbon throughout an agricultural landscape, thinking of DoD as an offset buyer. I really think that the next step in federal policy, but state policy too, is requiring major federal actions to be fully offset. And so I see a future market around demand by DoD for credits for impact for fossil fuel use, but also other emissions that it can't itself offset. And that has enormous potential for those ag landscapes, for land protection, for investment in conservation and sustainability. The place that I see that most sort of obviously already in federal law is some language in the 1969 National Environmental Policy Act, in NEPA, which has never been implemented, which talks about maximum recycling of depletable resources. So carbon, soil carbon, and carbon of any kind is inherently a depletable resource. And so there's a call already to build that into federal projects. So that's a place that I would love to see more activity, and where I got to think that the writing's on the wall to some extent on our need to do those things at some level. Federal being an obvious place to see leadership.
Well, and my immediate reaction was almost more from the farm finance system, and thinking about opportunities to embed better conservation incentives within just traditional agricultural loans and other ways that producers engage with their lenders or input providers or offtake partners. And there are some really interesting public-private partnerships happening right now, particularly around ag lending. Tim, you point out very well in this report that the military's best neighbors are farms and forests. And kind of in that vein, I think helping producers, especially in these heavily agrarian systems surrounding installations, to make the shift to viable operations, whatever that means for that farmer and their business model, and really giving them the tools to get rewarded for the transition to climate smart production practices.
Great. Thank you, Lee and Tim. We have one more, and then perhaps we might get to one last of these burning questions here. Got a question asking if the military collaborates with organizations like TEEB, which I believe is the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity. Alicia, please correct me in the chat if I'm wrong there, which is a global initiative looking to mainstream the values of biodiversity and ecosystem services into decision-making. So perhaps we can broaden that a little bit too and just ask, is that currently being valued in your understanding in the Sentinel landscapes and at these installations? And maybe how could that be furthered as a potential source of funding or opportunity?
I mean, I'm not aware of that specific partnership, but DoD is partnering with so many organizations that sound like have an overlap with the mission of that organization. I think the partnerships tend to be more regional and installation based. So the global stuff tends to be a little less obvious. They certainly, like a lot of the projects we described in the conversation that Lee, you and I had about quantifying, the kinds of outcomes, the ecosystem service outcomes, that's crucial. And making that a really pragmatic thing is, potentially something a partnership with this organization could help with. So, I mean, to me, those are all like our connections to that, that question. Although I don't know about existing partnership like that. And I think I'm not sure about the authorities to, every agency has its own authorities to sign basically MOUs and MOAs. But those kinds of structures can be really useful to basically establish, collaborative space. And those kinds of partnerships around ecosystem services could be really useful.
I think from my perspective, a limited understanding, admittedly, of the economics of ecosystem and biodiversity, TEEB, the kind of program or initiative, it kind of comes from the world natural capital. What is the value of X, Y, or Z ecosystem service function to the economy, to the landscape, what have you. And I think we're still figuring out how to turn that into a payment for ecosystem service. So I would place my bets on really not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, as we were talking about, and really making those attempts to figure out how to get people to actually, have money exchange hands around some measurable unit of demonstrable ecosystem service value. We're learning a lot. We have new protocols that might help us pilot soil carbon in more efficient and effective ways across producers. We have pretty functional mitigation banking and carbon markets, but there's a whole universe that is still really early in the market development stage. We need to be smart, we need to be science-based, and we need to really focus on who the beneficiaries are and how they have mechanisms or ways to pay. So I'll just throw that in.
If I can just jump back on that question for a moment. A lot of the ways, maybe the flaws of the way that we've thought about ecosystem services is that we always think of them as a transactional kind of thing. You're expecting someone to consider a project that's going to deplete natural resources, and so you want to know what they're worth so that you can defend them against depletion. But think of the context of, and I'm a former city councilman, so every year we get an audit. And our audit would include an assessment of what is the value, what is the worth of the things in the community that could be monetized in this case. And so it was the value of every single house in the community. It was $2 billion. So the community had 2 square miles, $2 billion of assets. Now, we weren't planning to raise all those houses ever. No one ever talked about even raising, more than one house that was abandoned or something, right? But we just think of it as an asset value. And I think if to this question, and I'll use Naval Station Earl as an example, what is the asset value of those wetlands, of those 2,000 wetlands on Naval Station Earl? Not in the context of them proposing to destroy them, just as a way to start capturing the value and just tracking it, right? Just tracking it over time. And I think of it more less on the market side and more on the human nature side, which is, we're all hoarders to some extent. And you have an asset that's worth something, you want more of it. So if you explain what the value of the natural assets are for an installation or in the landscape, and I think it's much easier to persuade people that we want there to be more of those assets, that the number going up as opposed to the number going down is our goal. And that's a conversation that gets away from the transactional nature, the expectation that someone's going to try to take this away. And it's more about just making it grow, right? So thinking about the asset value growing, the amount of carbon growing, just as a public goal. And so I think that to think about that conversation, that approach. So basically asset accounting of natural features, natural infrastructure, outside of a permitting development context is frankly, potentially one of the most exciting things that I see in the ecosystem service space today.
That's great. Thank you, Tim. And that's an excellent place to stop as well. We're right up to the hour here. So I just want to thank you, Tim, for joining us. Thank you, Lee, for your moderation and for your thoughts on this subject as well. Just as a reminder, we have recorded this session and we will be posting it up on our website in the next week or so. You can take a look at it there, as well as some other recorded webinars on this topic and on others. And a few other resources we've keyed up for you on our Sentinel Landscapes program page. So just thank you once more for joining us, everyone, and hope you have a lovely weekend.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Thanks, Lee. Thanks, Michelle.